The first VW engine I built for myself was this VW that you see my son in. My son was about 10 years old at the time. But when I worked at Smith Crossroads Ford here in Lenoir, we sold a VW to a Lenoir High School friend of mine, and the engine needed to be rebuilt, and I did that after hours. That was actually the first VW engine I had ever built. And it was a learning experience, and it continues to be a learning experience. So even though I've built between 20 and 30 engines, I am by no means a professional VW engine mechanic. I'm a single parent, raised my son Billy since he was 4 years old, and running a business by myself. Try that. I think Billy's 44 now. Still into Volkswagens though. There's always somebody out there with negative comments about videos. But think about this. Who else would try to help you free? Whether you agree with what I say or not, that's fine with me. But this is to help you. Think about it. It's not that I can't take criticism. I can. I was married for a year. Before we get started, I wanted to talk to you about splitting the case on a VW. I use an adjustable disc brake caliper spreader tool, and I put that in where the front pulley goes and also where the rear main seal goes. I use the spreader tool alternating between front and rear while tapping a putty knife in the top of the case above the flywheel where you won't do any damage to the sealing surfaces. If you have never done this before, make sure that your oil pump is out, and there's a special puller for that to remove that oil pump. You can remove the oil pump without special tools, but you'll probably damage the oil pump, and that might be okay because you're probably going to replace that anyway. But whatever you do, don't damage the sealing surface where the oil pump goes. Also, it's easy to overlook bolts in that case. One that comes to mind is very close to the flywheel and almost hidden. If you don't remove the oil pump and you don't remove all the bolts, you will damage the case. It's really helpful to have a micrometer and calipers as shown here to do the work that I'm about to show you. However, you can buy a very cheap set of measuring tools from Harbor Freight, so I would recommend that. Here I'm double checking some measurements I made just to be sure that I'm correct. This stock crank mic'd out good, so we're going to use it in this 1835 engine we're building for a bus. I use my manual that you see at the top of this photo on every engine I build for reference, because it's easy to make a mistake even when you've done this many times. I have a 20-ton press that I press the gears off, and of course you see here I've installed the new main bearings. I went through the oil passages on this crank with a wire brush. Before I had the tools to remove these gears, I would use a propane torch to remove and replace these gears, but just be careful, don't get carried away and remove the temper from the gears. Heat the gear evenly and heat it just enough to where you can tap the gear on or off. Make sure that your oil passages are clean. I used a micrometer to mic this crank to make sure it was in specs, and it is. I'm getting ready to install the rods on this crankshaft. Even though I have mic'd this crank, I still use plastic gauge on every bearing. I always do that. I like to see between 1.5 to 2 thousandths on the rods and the mains. And I use 1 to 3 thousandths plastic gauge, which can be found at most auto supply stores. I know Napa has it. You need to be surgically clean in doing this. And I clean the threads and the nuts with a Q-tip with lacquer thinner, and then applied Loctite. And after doing that, you can also stake the nuts. The rod nuts have a little ridge where you can stake them in a groove on the rod. Here you see assembly lube on one of the rod bearings, and these wrist pin bushings checked out fine. They're good. They won't have to be replaced. A proper fit for that wrist pin is this. You should be able to push that pin through the rod easily by hand. Holding the rod horizontally, the pin should stay in the rod if it's a perfect fit. Consult the manual for the specifications on clearance on these wrist pins. One way to check for a bent rod is to place a straight metal edge, like a metal ruler, across the big and little ends of the rod. You should have contact at 4 places, 2 on the big end, 2 on the little end. Now that's just a rough way to tell whether or not you have a bent rod. I use red Loctite. This projection on the rod goes up, as you see where the arrow is, and you see the same in the book at the top of the screen. Be sure to not mix your end caps, your rod end caps, up, and make sure that the rod end cap is on the rod properly. If you have never done this before, you need to be following a manual. The notch in the cap and the notch in the rod for the bearing should go together. Here I'm using a chisel to stake that rod nut to the notch in the rod, as shown here. And this shows doing the same. Here the cranking rods are assembled and ready for installation. Please note the installation of the cam gears, and especially note the oil slinger at the bottom has the dished side facing down. Of course, to your right, front is 1 and 2, and then on the left you have 4, and 3 is at the top next to the flywheel. Here are a couple of photos that show the relationship between the timing gear and the cam and how the gear should be installed and aligned, and you can see the timing mark on the left. You can make an adjustable push rod. If you've changed your stroke, you'll need to make a new set of push rods. You can use this tool that you make using an aluminum push rod and a piece of 1/4 inch threaded rod. I have made shorter push rods by lightly tapping the end of the push rod on a vise around the hardened tip, and the tip will loosen up and come out. Cut your push rod to the proper length and drive the removed tip back into the push rod using 2 O lifters. Here I've mounted the cylinder 3 and 4 side of the block. I'm using my engine stand, which makes things go a lot easier. Now this block has been thoroughly cleaned. All the oil passages have been cleaned with a brush and blown out, washed out with solvent, inspected for cracks, and most important is checking the main bearing surfaces to make sure they have not been pounded, have been imprinted by the bearing. If so, you'll have to line bore the case. I clean all studs with a die, as you see here. Everybody has different ways of doing things, and if it works for you, great. These chrome Chinese distributor clamps don't work well at all. Use the original. Here I have inspected and cleaned a 009 distributor, new points condenser, new O-ring seal, and I have set up the endplay of the distributor gear to 5 thousandths. If necessary, you can make your own shims from a tin can to get the tolerance you want, but make sure the shim you make is between the two hardened shims that VW uses. This is the distributor seal and also the spring that you must use with your distributor gear. Having the distributor end play correct helps eliminate the change in timing. The timing will fluctuate if you have too much distributor end play. You can see in this photo where I've aligned the rotor with the mark on the distributor housing. This is the way number 1 should look, and the reason for that is number 3 cylinder tends to run hotter. So number 3 cylinder, I believe, is 2 or 3 degrees retarded to make it run cooler. So number 3 distributor lobe is a little retarded. So am I. That makes us even. These used heads have been machined for 92s, and they've been checked for cracks. The guides were good. I used to do my own valve work when I was at Smith Crossroads Ford, but since I've had my own shop, I send out all the valve work. Let me give you a little bit of advice learned the hard way. Never knurl valve guides. If you need valve guides, replace them with a silicone bronze valve guide. Don't knurl them. It will not last. I have never used anything but SEMA moly pistons and cylinders. The pistons are graphite coated, and in my opinion, these are the best pistons and cylinders you can buy. I number the pistons and never mix your pistons and pins. When you buy a piston and cylinder set like this, you don't have to worry about the end gaps on the piston rings. They're already preset, and I have never found a set of pistons and cylinders to have the gap set wrong. If you look carefully, you see a difference in color of that oil control ring. This oil control ring is in 3 pieces. The center part where you see the color code must butt and not overlap, and that's the reason for the colors. You can clearly see if it's overlap. Then the 2 rings, identical above and below that center part. Be sure that the 2 identical ring gaps are staggered and away from the center part gap where the color code is. Staggered about 1 inch is fine. If you were installing a new set of rings only, you would take a piston ring and put it inside the cylinder and then slide the piston down in it without rings to square that ring up in the bore. Then with a feeler gauge you measure the end gap. If the end gap's incorrect, then you can use a file and a vise to file that end gap to the correct specification, holding the ring in your hands as you do so. We replaced all the valves and went with heavy-duty springs as well. In my opinion, you should at least replace the exhaust valves, unless you know they're fairly new, because the valves that are most likely to break, the ones that get the hottest, of course, are the exhaust valves. Especially number 3, it tends to run the hottest. And I know you don't want to take a chance with all this money invested in a new engine. New distributor cap, rotor, points, condenser, and I've checked out the distributor really good to make sure it's okay, bushings and all, weights, everything okay. Use Bosch ignition parts on a VW Beetle. You won't regret it. All 009s I have seen use just 1 weight spring, although there's a place for 2. Here I'm balancing the rods with a postal scale that I ordered just for this. There are videos on YouTube that show how to balance your rods. If you can, it's a good idea to pick out 4 rods that are very close in weight to start with. It'll save you a lot of grinding and weighing. Balancing your rods is an option, not a necessity, but I think it's a good idea. Absolutely necessary for a high-performance engine. And here's the Engel cam that my son chose for this engine. This is the first time that my son has actually watched me build an engine. I'm trying to teach him how to do this. He was so young, of course, when I built the first one that he wasn't interested in VWs at all. At my age, he needs to know how to do this if he's going to continue working on VWs, because you never can tell what engine will be my last. This is Engel W110. Here's the Engel springs and lifters kit. Good idea to order it with the cam. And we chose an Engel cam with mild duration and low end torque. Too wild a cam and something heavy like a bus will kill the low end power, so be careful about choosing your cam. Here I'm grinding and weighing the piston end of the rod. Now the heads are back from the machinist with the new valves and new springs, all cleaned up. Checked for cracks, everything's fine. Looks good. Check your head exhaust studs and make sure the threads are in good shape. And either run a nut down on them with WD-40 or use a die from a tap and die set to make sure that the threads are in good shape, because it can save you a lot of grief when you put this engine together and start to put the exhaust on it. We have also CC'd these heads because we're going to figure our compression ratio. J-Bugs has a chart online to help you figure your compression ratio. Many years ago, when I had a set of heads cut for compression, shaved in other words, when I got them back, I put them on and I had no compression. Why? Because these little projections, these little bosses, have to be ground off. If not, if you've cut your heads much, the head will actually come down against the cylinder fins and not bottom out to seal, so be aware of that. Here I have placed my plastic CC plate in the head, as you see in the background, with a light coat of grease around the edge so it will seal. Then I usually start with a 50 cc syringe and 50 cc's of transmission fluid, and I carefully inject that fluid into the hole in the plastic plate. Then I use smaller syringes when the combustion chamber is almost full to get it exactly right. Of course, you have to have a spark plug in the hole. I have forgotten what these heads CC'd at, but I believe it was 55 cc chambers. You need 4 things to figure your compression ratio: bore, stroke, cylinder deck height, and combustion chamber volume, as I'm doing here. Then you can use the compression calculator using those figures at J-Bugs to figure your final compression ratio. Here is a better view of that plate, again with just a very thin coating of Vaseline or grease around the edge to seal. And you see that I have filled this chamber up with the head level. It's completely full to the hole, as you see in this photo. All 4 of your chambers should be identical, especially so for a race engine. Another view of me injecting that transmission fluid into that plastic plate hole. Don't lose all these little dowel pins that hold your bearings in place. When you press on your new bearings on your crankshaft, make sure the bearings are turned the proper way for this dowel pin. Also, it's a real good idea, if you have a set of tap and dies, is to take a die and clean all of your stud threads when you clean your case. This is the hole in the bearing for the dowel pin that keeps the bearing from turning. Use a little red Loctite to hold that dowel in place in the block. To be technical, on a VW it's a case. On American engine it's a block. Don't forget the half of the main bearing that goes in the other half of your case. It's easy to forget that. Be sure and use a good assembly lube on all bearings. You can use white Lubriplate, that works well too. Now I'm putting the cam bearings in place. This is a double thrust cam set. A stock VW cam bearing set will come with just one of these. A special double thrust set will come with two of these. The little tang on one half of this thrust bearing will be removed. There is no groove in one case half for that tang. Very gently tapping that cam bearing half into the case with a plastic mallet. For heavier valve spring pressures, double thrust is always better. You will need to grind off this little locating tab or tap it flat. I chose to tap it flat. Here I'm coating the lifters with wheel bearing grease. Good thick grease will hold those lifters in place in case you don't have the clips, which I no longer have. I don't recommend using grease like this if you're using full synthetic oil. And there's a difference of opinion about oils, but I've done intensive research on oils. And the most recommended is Castrol 2050, and that's what I use. Using a common grease like this might not mix well with full synthetic oil. Now I have installed the lifters in both sides of the case, and assembly lube is on the face of the lifters. Installing the large main bearing on the flywheel end of the crank with some assembly lube. The groove in the block for the cam plug at the end of the camshaft is shown here must be absolutely clean. I use the Permatex gasket compound in a tube, and all it is condensed Indian head shellac, condensed into a paste, and it's the same color, the brown color. This shows the correct installation of the cam plug, which has been cleaned by holding the inside of it with snap ring pliers and using the wire brush on my bench grinder. This is a good photo showing all the gears, and I have put assembly lube on these gears. Notice I'm holding number 1 rod straight up, which would be top dead center. And since my distributor is on number 1, the engine will be in time. Actually, I made a small mistake here. Put your crank in first, and then you can roll in the cam and timing gear. And don't forget your assembly lube on the cam bearings when you roll this cam in, and it should be in time as shown here. What I mean by roll the cam in is line your timing marks up with the cam slightly out of the case and then roll the cam into the case. I've colored these marks so you could see them better. You can see on the end of this rod where I have ground off material to balance that rod. This shows how the oil slinger on the front of the crankshaft should be concave to the outside. These 3 cam timing gear bolts are special. They're serrated and self-locking, but I also use red Loctite. As I have said, make sure this main bearing is turned to where it drops down on the dowel pin. You see one of the case studs with an O-ring seal. Of course, the single timing mark on the timing gear goes between the 2 marks on the crank gear as shown here. So with your rotor pointing to number 1, and number 1 rod all the way out top dead center when I dropped it in the case, and the timing gear in time properly as you saw here, when this engine's together it should fire right up. The red arrow shows the locating tab on the cam bearing, and the yellow arrow shows where an O-ring goes, the case sealing O-rings, don't forget those, and the green arrow shows a better view of how that rod nut is staked to the rod to lock that nut. One thing I want to mention here that's critical, it's a little tricky to turn those main bearings to make them fall into place on the little dowel pin in the case. Make sure that that crankshaft is all the way down and the bearings are over the dowel pins, because if you tighten the case and the dowel pins and the bearings are not in the proper location, you'll ruin the case. That is an easy mistake to make, to overlook. Applying a thin, even coat of Indian head shellac, making sure there's no debris in it, and doing the same to the other side of the case. And you apply another thin coat on the other case half as well. And again, don't forget your case sealing O-rings on the studs. I'm going to mention this more than one time. Be sure that your lifters are greased and stuck in this top half of the case. Be sure your cam plug is in position. Be sure your stud seals, the O-rings, are in position, and that the other half of that main bearing is installed in the other half of the case that we're going to drop down and install. Tap the case half carefully into position, tapping evenly as you go. I have always used Permatex shellac on both sides of the engine case, both the sealing surfaces, and have never had a leak using this product. Use the nuts and washers and pull your case together gently with just moderate pressure, making sure that everything's going together without being in a bind. Once the case is drawn together and the Permatex starts to seep out a little bit, be forced out a little bit, you'll know that you're home free, and then you can torque that case. Be sure to use all torque specifications in building this engine. Refer to a manual. The flat side of the camshaft plug goes into the case with the flat side towards the cam. Make sure that the cam plug groove in the case is completely clean and free of old gasket material. I want to say this again because this is where a beginner will make a mistake. Do not force the case halves together. Go very, very gently until you see the Permatex start to ooze out to be sure you're not in a bind. After I'm sure that nothing's in a bind and the case halves went together easily, then I install all nuts and washers with my 3/8 air wrench just to run the nuts up lightly. Then I'll torque. Of course, there are two gaskets for the oil pump. The one on your left is between the pump and the case, the one on the right between the pump and the cover. It's really hard to find a good brand of oil pump these days. Most of them are made in China, but we found this one, and I would recommend this. It looks like it's very high quality. Lay your oil pump gaskets on a clean piece of paper and coat them with a very thin coat of Permatex. Turn them over and do the same. Install the gasket between the pump and the block over the studs, being sure that the block is clean, and then gently tap your oil pump into place, making sure that the oil pump projection fits into the slot on the camshaft as you go. These special oil pump nuts have a seal, as you see here. Use these. For the way I'm doing this adapter plate for the Mustache bar will have to be modified. This is the way I wanted to mount that adapter for the Mustache bar to the VW Beetle case. I chose to install the oil pump plate with the nuts between the oil pump plate and the adapter plate. I just didn't want to use the oil pump studs as the only mounting for this Mustache bar. You can see the bottom bracket hole doesn't line up, so I'll slice that, bend it, and then weld it. Where you see the two vertical studs, I bored and tapped the case. Where the bug case is not drilled and tapped, the bus case is. This makes for a much stronger mount. Of course, you need to check your transaxle mount too to make sure it's not mushy and in good shape. You will need spacers between this adapter plate and the block where I drill for the studs, and I think there's a photo of that. Just flat washer spacers. Here you can see the washer as a spacer between the block and the adapter plate. I'm installing all the nuts and washers and bolts around the case. The studs I made to put in the case where I tapped it for this adapter, I wanted them to fit really tight, so I used Teflon tape. Now we're going to measure the deck height and make sure both cylinders are even with each other as they should be. The thickness of this deck height plate is 450 thousandths, so it will be subtracted. The little bolt you see in the center of this plate is to help you find top dead center. And of course the piston has to be at top dead center in order to figure your deck height. You see the spacers on two studs holding that deck height plate in position. Here I'm making a trial fit of that Mustache bar on the adapter plate. Now with the piston at top dead center, I'm measuring the deck height, and I will subtract that 450 thousandths thickness of the plate, which will leave me the correct deck height. Your deck height should come up the same on both cylinders on the same side. Also, you can lay a metal straight edge across these two cylinders to make sure you're getting contact at all 4 points, which will indicate that both cylinders are even with the case. If not, you're going to have to shim or machine. Especially for high performance engines, the deck height should be the same on all 4 cylinders. If one cylinder is below or above the other cylinder, your head won't seal. Our measurements concluded that we ended up with a 9.2 compression ratio, and my son intends to run high test gas in this, so that's going to work out good. You could possibly go higher with your compression ratio, but I like to stay on the safe side. As long as you use nuts and spacers to hold your cylinders down lightly to the block, you don't need these special tools to figure your deck height. You could lay a straight edge across the top of that cylinder and use feeler gauges to measure your deck height. I have so many special tools because I do so much of this, but you can get by probably with the tools that you already have. Here I'm cleaning the jug, the cylinder, with lacquer thinner really good to remove all grease. I go over this with lacquer thinner at least twice. A good heavy bead of Permatex Ultra Blue, which I prefer over the red, the Ultra Blue, on the sealing ledge of the cylinder. Then with a clean glove, I go around that cylinder with my finger, as you see here, spreading the sealer evenly. Be sure and clean the block and the block hole for the cylinder as well with lacquer thinner. Ultra Blue has always worked well for me when I used it. You may want to use a different compound, but this works great for me. Be sure to lubricate your piston rings with oil before installation. This is something that so many building an engine, be it a VW or be it a Chevrolet, so many people don't pay attention to the ring gaps and the ring gap positions. On a horizontally opposed engine like a VW, of course, oil will tend to gather at the bottom of the cylinder, and that's where you do not want your end gaps on your rings to be. So stagger your ring gaps as shown here. Now compression ring 1 and 2, it doesn't make any difference as long as they're staggered. Now I'm ready to install the cylinders over the pistons using my ring compressor. It is possible to use a worm drive hose clamp in place of a ring compressor. I have done it before years ago. But again, this is a place where a beginner can easily make a mistake. After making sure that your ring gaps are staggered correctly, as shown previously, then you just lightly tap that cylinder down over the piston. If you go too heavy, you can break a ring. If you're doing this properly, it should tap on there fairly easily. Breaking a ring is a serious thing, and they're very brittle, and they can break easily. And if you break one, you're going to have to buy a whole new ring set. The trick to using a ring compressor shown here, or a hose clamp, and by the way, ring compressors usually have a top and a bottom, so be sure that you have it placed on the piston correctly. But the trick is, with a ring compressor or a hose clamp, is to have it snug, not tight. Too tight, you won't be able to tap your cylinder down. Too loose, you're going to catch the edge of a ring. The only thing about this ring compressor is that there is just enough room, and you have to really move it around, trial and error. But you have to move that band around to get it out. It's very close. When you put your piston pins into the piston, be sure that these little circlips, the little clip that holds a wrist pin in, be sure they're fully seated. Be absolutely sure of that. When you put the pistons on the rods, it's best to start with the piston closest to the flywheel. I put the clip in the piston to the flywheel side, then put the piston over the rod, and I push the wrist pin in and put the other clip on. When you put the cylinder closest to the pulley, you're going to have to do the same thing. You're going to have to put the clip on that piston because there won't be enough room between the two cylinders. Now, on some of the engines I've built, I have used Teflon buttons instead of these clips, but Teflon buttons add weight. So if these clips are new or in real good shape, you don't have to worry, they won't come out. But too much crankshaft in play can cause them to come out, and a bent rod can cause them to come out. Just a little humor here. My son took a photo of me, and of course I flared my eyes. Actually, this is the best photo taken of me. This shows the oil sump plate. Be sure and use your copper sealing washer, and use the special VW acorn nuts. An acorn nut is rounded on one side and is sealed. I mentioned laying a straight edge across the cylinders, as you see here, to make sure that they're both level, that it's contacting on all four places so the cylinder head will seal properly. To check that you have the proper push rod length, with the valve halfway open, the valve adjusting screw should hit the center of the valve, and it did here. So as the valve opens, it moves from one edge of the valve stem to the opposite edge of the valve stem. But again, unless you're changing stroke or cutting your heads a bunch, you won't need to change push rods. If your push rods are too long, if you've cut your heads a bunch, you can use shims under the rocker arm stands to make up for a slight difference. You have an O-ring seal that seals the stud for the rocker arm shaft on the cylinder head. Here you see we're using cool tin, which I think is a good idea. The cool tin goes on first, and then the heads and the push rod tube at the same time. Just a personal preference, but I like to coat those pushrod tube seals with a little bit of the Permatex shellac. It lets them slide in easier and it seals them real good. Now the pushrod seals and pushrods are installed and the heads torqued. Draw these heads down evenly, and this goes for the case too, in a crisscross pattern a little bit at a time. You want to draw it down evenly. You pros will know that, but there's a lot of people, a lot of beginners that won't know that. Now is the time to adjust your valves before you install your spark plugs. And after you have run this engine for a couple of hours, you need to go back through the valves. Now I'm ready for the oil cooler. Now the oil cooler is installed, and it's a good idea to flush out that oil cooler with solvent. And you can pressure test it if you like with a little bit of shop air, if it's a used cooler and you don't know the condition of that cooler. I set my air pressure regulator down to 20 pounds and test these oil coolers in a 5-gallon bucket. Make sure that you use the correct oil seal for the oil cooler. Shown here are 2 different types. After my heads are installed and before the rocker arms are installed, I screw this into the spark plug hole and check to make sure that the cylinder holds pressure. Just a good quick check to make sure everything's sealed. Do this before you go any further to make sure there's no major problems. This photo shows the tool in the spark plug hole. I just use a rubber hose attached to this adapter and blow through it with my mouth to make sure that it holds pressure, and it did. Now these intake gaskets, the ports and the intake have been matched with a die grinder. My son did that. This is not absolutely necessary, but will help the performance if you match the ports. We used a stock gasket and marked around the ports and opened that up with a die grinder, and we did the same, matching the intakes to the heads perfectly. This is a little air pressure adapter that I use to make sure that the cylinders are holding compression. Just another view of that block with the oil cooler installed. Be sure and put this piece of engine tin on before you put your pulley on. Don't forget that. I use Loctite on all engine tin screws because I have seen them come loose so many times. These crank pulleys can be really hard to get off. Let me tell you how I do it. I use a steering wheel puller with bolts through the holes you see here in the pulley and nuts and washers behind it. And a common steering wheel puller works great for that. Of course, you could make something using a piece of channel iron or angle iron with a center hole drilled in it for your center bolt, and then 2 holes on either side for the attachment bolts to the pulley. The center bolt through the angle iron with a nut on the other side, and when you screw the center bolt in, it'll force the pulley off. Wish I had a photo of that. Installing the cooling fan with an impact lightly. Just a little Loctite as well. Here is the special tool I have for setting up crankshaft endplay. You don't have to have this, you can make one. When you pry the flywheel lightly back, you adjust the adjusting screw to where it just touches the flywheel. Then when you push the flywheel forward towards the pulley end, you run a feeler gauge in there and it'll show you how much clearance you have, how much end play you have. Now you can see the cam plug, and the recessed part of the cam plug is what you see here, the flat side towards the cam. Now when the engine's together, you need to set the crankshaft end play. And you have to do that before you install the seal because you can't get the shims past the seal. So how you do this is this way. Install one shim and then the flywheel, and bolt the flywheel down. Use the gland nut and tighten it just snug. They make a special tool as seen here on the upper left and in a previous photo, but you can make your own tool. I've done that before. So with the flywheel installed, very lightly pry that flywheel to the rear towards you, and then put your little tool that you made, bolt it to the case to where you can see and measure the clearance as you push the flywheel towards the front pulley side. I mention this again because it's absolutely critical. Then you'll have to have a micrometer to do this properly, but you need to measure what you will need in shims, less 4 or 5 thousandths, to set your end play. Be sure not to tighten that flywheel against the block to where it won't turn. You can damage the block. This is a critical, very precision part, one of the hardest parts for a beginner. Only when your end play measures 4 or 5 thousandths are you ready to install the oil seal after the shims are in place. And I like the red oil seal the best. I take that over the black. Late model flywheels use an O-ring seal instead of the paper gasket. Make sure you lubricate this O-ring. Make sure the O-ring groove is clean. Don't install this O-ring while you are setting the crankshaft in play. Wait until you're ready to put the flywheel on for the final time. Then with your shims in place, your seal in place, and the seal lubricated, and this O-ring lubricated, then you're ready to bolt on your flywheel. There's so much junk out there that even buying a fuel pump is hard these days. This is what we used. I liked it. It takes a special tool to remove this oil filler nut as you see here. But you need to remove that if this is an old U-stand and put a new gasket underneath that. I made a tool to remove that out of a nut and a piece of bar stock that fits the slot. I made this little engine test stand out of some 2x4s, and the reason it's angled is it will fit on my engine hoist where I can roll the whole thing around. And you can see some U-bolts here where I can lift that up with my engine hoist should I need to. This is on casters, by the way, where it can roll around freely. The engine is not bolted down to this, does not have to be. You would be surprised how smoothly one of these VW engines can run and how little vibration it has. It won't go anywhere. It'll sit right here on this stand. It does sit on a piece of foam rubber about a ½ an inch thick with a square hole cut in it to where I can drain the oil out of this engine if I want to with it still on this stand. I used an old Transaxle case and cut part of it away, the part that I didn't need, just the part for the starter. And of course battery cables, or I can use my battery charger to crank it. I have wired an ignition switch with a warning light, and it is fused for safety over near the battery cable. Now you can see the piece of foam rubber that this engine sits on. We're getting the fan housing and the alternator ready to bolt on. My son got a real kick out of these brazing glasses I use for brazing. He said I look like an old retired geezer living in Florida. Well, he's partially right. I am an old retired geezer, but I don't live in Florida. But my nickname on the Samba website forum is Bug Geezer. Trust me, if you work on VWs, you'll need a sense of humor. Well, I don't recommend welding or brazing with shorts on, but here I'm showing my son how to patch up heater boxes by brazing in metal. I taught my son how to braze, and he's brazing up holes in these heater boxes. He caught on quickly. Now we're ready for the rest of the sheet metal and the intake. All of the sheet metal's installed now, and we have to use that special motor support for a bus. We have to install that. That motor support bar is also referred to as a Mustache bar. And on a bus, it must be installed before the exhaust is installed. A rear view of the engine test stand and the sheet metal. Another side view. The heater boxes are installed to the heads loosely for right now, because you'll have to move that around as you install the Mustache bar and the exhaust. Another side view of the heater boxes. Ignition switch and light. I have my oil pressure gauge installed. I want to know that oil pressure immediately. This is just a trial fit of the exhaust. The Mustache bar will have to be mounted first. The engine fuel line was full of rust, and I cleaned that out with an electric drill and a speedometer cable. Now the Mustache bar and motor supports and exhaust are all mounted to the engine. The Mustache bar adapter kit was a real aggravation, came with very little instructions. You have to use an adapter kit to adapt this Mustache bar to a standard VW Beetle engine. It is not drilled or tapped for that mount. I chose to tap that block for two long studs to hold that Mustache bar adapter. Now the exhaust is on and the Mustache bar. Now we're getting ready to test run this engine. We used a digital thermometer to make sure that the thermostat was opening at the proper temperature. It should be fully open at 160 degrees. In checking the temperature as we were running this engine, I was shooting the thermometer right over the exhaust, so that scared me a little bit. I realized what I was doing wrong and shot the later temperatures from the rear of the engine at the crankcase. If you have minor oil leaks at the valve covers, you may want to tighten these bales by bending the ends of them as shown here. You can make that a little bit tighter, and you can make it tighter on one side rather than the other if that's what you need. But I've had to do this many times. I much prefer the stock valve covers and the stock bales over this chrome plated junk. It just never works out for me. I always use hose clamps on fuel lines. I know it's only 3 pounds pressure, but I always use clamps. One thing I wanted to mention on these Holley Weber carburetors, there's a little set screw underneath the secondaries that might hold the secondary open a little bit. So be sure that the secondaries are closed before you start your idle speed and mixture adjustments. The throttle blade will stick in the bore if you back this screw off too much, so be careful when you adjust that. Adjust it to where it's closed but not sticking. You may have to adjust that screw with the carburetor off. There's a lot of controversy and a lot of opinions about Holley Weber carburetors. For the money and for the fuel economy, you cannot beat a Holley Weber. We've used them for 35 years. Some people say that they hesitate and cannot be made to work with a 009 distributor, and that is not true at all. If properly jetted, these carburetors can be smooth as silk even with a 009 distributor. Fuel pressure on a stock VW is 3 pounds, but you can go a little above that with a Holley Weber, 6 or 7 pounds. So you can adjust the fuel pump pressure by the addition or subtraction of gaskets underneath your fuel pump. So if you have carburetor problems, make sure that you're getting the proper pressure and volume from the fuel pump. These distributor cap clips can be tightened if need be. Sometimes they get weak and they lose their tension. So you can just bend them a little bit with power pliers and increase the tension on them. Gene Berg highly recommends the use of a thermostat. I know a lot of people don't believe in it, and I used to not use them too, but it will really increase the life of an engine if you have a properly installed and working thermostat. Volkswagen really knew what they were doing when they designed this cooling system, shutters and all, so use them. Here you see I have an inline fuse to the choke, and I have a little bit of shrink tubing around it to protect the terminals. I have seen so many fires that were started by shorts that ruin the wiring harness. Shorts that occur where the choke housing on these Holley Webers touch the fan shroud. Use a fuse that might save your Volkswagen. All the fuel lines are installed in a fuel filter, and all of them are clamped. You see just how close the choke, the electric choke on this Holley Weber is to the fan shroud. That's where the shorts occur. If your oil cap still has a good gasket, but it's too loose, you can bend these little retaining tabs to where it'll fit tighter. I did. I mark the timing marks, as you see here, and I also make a mark 180 degrees on the pulley for adjusting the valves. On a 009 distributor, I like to run 28 to 30 degrees total advance and go from there. You really need to know your engine temperatures as you crank a new engine, rebuilt engine. And you can't beat one of these digital thermometers to keep you posted as to what is going on. This primary fuel jet on the primary side was completely clogged up where I couldn't adjust the idle at all. Be sure that your Holley Weber choke linkage has little hairpin clips as shown here, or you may have to drill the rod as I have done here and use what I call half hairpin clips to retain that rod. That works out great, and you won't have to worry about it coming loose again. As shown here. The left screw shows the choke fast idle adjustment. So if it idles too fast cold, back that screw off. The other two red arrows on the right show the index markings on the choke for choke adjustment. Another view of the choke fast idle screw and cam. This is really hard to see and to get to. I have always used Satch, the clutch disc and the pressure plate, or if I want a stronger pressure plate, I use the Kennedy. Clean all the holes in the flywheel as seen here to remove old grease and debris, and wipe the surface of the flywheel down with lacquer thinner. Make sure it's absolutely clean. It's great to have an old main shaft when you install your clutch disc as shown here. The hub should go towards the transaxle as shown here. With your main shaft through the disc and held to center, lightly tighten all the bolts evenly in a crisscross pattern around your pressure plate. Some flywheels will have a ridge around the pressure plate as shown here. It's a slight inset and the pressure plate goes just like you see. These pressure plate bolts are special bolts, but not to say that you have to use these. Now I have the engine carefully balanced on my floor jack, ready for installation. I don't remove the hoist until I'm sure that engine is balanced and stable on that jack. It's best to have two people doing this, especially on a bus. And I don't move that engine unless I have someone to keep it balanced. This is just a little harder than the installation on a regular Beetle. That exhaust and cross member has to go high as you go in, but it will go in without a lot of trouble. I did so much of this when I was young without the proper tools in my driveway, and I know it's hard. We used a chain to hold that transaxle up, but just be sure that your chain is far back enough that it is not in the way of the heater boxes as you install the engine. This one went in easier than most. It's all the way in now. Here we also used an additional jack and blocks under the transaxle because we had to move that chain a little bit. The chain was in the way of the heater boxes. Once fully in, you'll see that the motor supports line up. The upper two engine bolts are a nightmare to get to on this. I used a piece of tape around my finger and the nut stuck to it in order to get my finger in there while my son turned the bolt to get it started. Very hard to get to. This is an old trick. Magnet might work too, but this worked for me. Now it's time to hook up all the engine wiring and the fuel line and the battery cables and all the miscellaneous. This is my son Billy. Billy, turn around and say hi to these folks. He won't. He must be shy today. In my videos, and I always say this, I try to explain things in very basic terms so that even if you've never done this before, it shouldn't be hard for you to do if you follow my video. So this video might bore you professionals to tears, but you know, this is for people that don't know how to do this. The battery tray was rusted away, so I had to weld in some scrap metal I had. It didn't have one big piece, used 3 small pieces to put a new tray in. And I like interstate batteries. That's all I'll ever use. I've had some go 10 years. Be sure to check the water even in a new battery. And I ordered a fiberglass battery box and strap, and so we used that. That was only like $14, I believe, from Amazon. It's a myth that if you put a battery on concrete, it'll discharge. The truth of it is, if there's surface contamination, dirt, and grease and grime on the battery itself or on the side, current can actually flow through that. I've checked it with a voltmeter. Later I might make metal brackets to go in place of these plastic ones that are used for the battery hold-down strap. And I'm going to own up to another mistake. I mounted these brackets and strap wrong. It should be the other way. That's something I'll have to correct. I make mistakes. I made one by getting up this morning. I bought this box large enough, I believe, for a Group 24 battery, because if I ever wanted to put a bigger battery in here, I could. To keep my battery from sliding around, I just used a little piece of 2x4. This bus has a lot of rust in it, like all buses do, and so I've welded in several panels. Now this is just going to be a daily driver, so it's going to be rough. We're not worried about that. All my vehicles are show vehicles, and I wanted something that I could drive and not worry about it. And so my son and I went in halfers on this bus, 71 bus. And I'll slowly do some body work on it, but like I say, I don't know if I'll ever even get around to painting or not. Paint's so expensive, it's not worth painting a rust bucket. Maybe I'll paint it someday if I ever get enough panels replaced. Rocker panels looking good. Got the first stage of Bondo on that. Bodywork and paint has been a hobby of mine for 30 or 40 years now. My son got this linoleum from Lowe's. He likes that. Now we have to put the sink and the cabinets and everything else back. Hi, I'm Bill Tate here in Lenoir, North Carolina. On May the 13th, a very rainy, cloudy, cold day. We're going to run this new engine that we just got through building. My son and I have been working on VW since he was 10 years old. He's 43 now. So this may be one of the last engines I built. This is an 1835, and I'll go into detail on that later. I'm going to run this engine in a little bit after I do some minor tweaks to it. It's really basically ready to put in as soon as I put the clutch and pressure plate on it. The clutch disc and pressure plate. You see here my little bottle of gasoline, and I'll show you more about how I have this wired and how I have it set up on this little engine stand that I threw together. All you need is a little box made of 2x4s to sit it on. This is on casters, but you don't have to do that. But this works real well. It doesn't vibrate much at all. It serves the purpose. I'm really more known for Lenoir and Caldwell County history on Facebook. I'm a member of our board of directors at our local museum, the Caldwell Heritage Museum. But this has always been a hobby. I never worked on VWs when I owned this Tate's Auto Service where we are now on Freeway Drive. But it continues to be a hobby. I've worked hard all my life physically, and if I don't work hard, I feel terrible. So that's the rut I'm in. But we have bought, sold, traded, restored, I guess 18 to 20 VWs now, VW Bills and peripheral buses, and it's just a father and son hobby. We both enjoy it. My son Billy's not here today. He works for UPS and he's busy, and I've got to do just a few minor tweaks to this to get it ready to put in. We'll run it in a little bit, but right now I'm going to do a little video around this engine stand. Now, as you see here, I have an old Transaxle case that I've cut in two. I have an ignition switch and a little light, and that's fused. That ignition is fused. And I have my remote starter switch, as you see, beside the battery here. And so basically, along with the jug full of gasoline, all I do is flick the switch and hit the starter, and off she goes. And like I say, you don't need to make anything elaborate as far as a little engine stand. Just a little box of 2x4s to set the engine on. Leave the sump clear. Just make a little square box. Leave the oil sump plate clear. And that's all you need to do. Now this one's on casters, as I said. And I also have some chains here where I can pick the whole engine stand up with my engine hoist if I need to. I removed the plugs and ran an oil pressure test. gauge is about 5 pounds low. It's an old gauge. This one's hooked up here. You can hook it up. You got one hooked up? Yeah, hook it to the battery. It's positive. Give me a little bit more. Give me the thing. Sounds like timing might be a little bit slow. Timing is very close, but a little slow. Lay it. We're going to run the timing up, but what I didn't know is the primary idle jet was clogged solid.
Hold on. Timing's way too. I can't find my fit. Hold on.
It's 10. It's supposed to be 10 minutes.
Yeah, I know. But it's not. I didn't think I tightened it that tight, but I guess I did.
Don't ever over tighten that clamp. You know that because we discussed that. It'll bend. You know?
Yeah.
And then it forces it.
Oh, I can't get it. I see what it is. It's too far against that. I'm gonna have to get something in there to
get those needle nose pliers maybe, or open end. The chrome plated distributor hold down is junk, and it's hard to get a socket on. You got the timing that slow and it backfires through the carburetor, it starts serious fire. If you tighten the distributor hold down too tight, it'll bend, lifting the distributor up.
That might be enough. Let's see if it'll. Not yet. No. The clamps right against that.
I know, it's just like everything we do.
There we go. You just leave it loose.
Yeah, it's awful tight in there. I guess that gasket.
Yeah.
Let's see if that helped. I later removed that distributor and replaced the O-ring because the new O-ring for some reason was too big. Never ran into that before, but replaced it. It was too hard to turn. We go the wrong way with it. It sounds like it.
Yeah, it does.
Did we? I've forgotten. I
Yeah,
forgot.
you have to go. Yeah. Yeah. That's awful high oil pressure.
Sounds good, bud.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, if you can ever get it to idle.
After cleaning the idle primary jet, which was clogged solid, I was able to bring it back down to an idle. But even at that, the idle is too lean, and I'm going to have to go through this carburetor and find out why it's so lean. But it runs good out on the road. You couldn't ask for it to run any better. It's just that little rough, lean idle that we have to take care of.
Why does the choke come off already? Is it?
Well, it's
hard
electric
for
choke. They open up quick. My son was pointing that infrared thermometer right over the exhaust, so we got an extremely high reading without thinking about that, and went into panic mode for a few minutes till we figured out what we did wrong. Then we shot the temperature reading at the back at the crankcase. All was well and normal, 170 degrees. I've used these Holly Webers for years. I really like them. They flat put out the power. I have the idle transition jet bored out to 25 thousandths. That's on the primary side, and it's on the back side of this carburetor. You can't see it, but you can see the jet here on the secondary side. I leave that alone. We run the timing at 28 total degrees. I have a snap-on light where I can dial in the advance. And 28 total advance is a good place to start. Now this is the bus I've been working on. My wire welder. I've been welding in some sheet metal panels, both inside and out. Now, this bus is not going to be a show vehicle. This is just going to be a daily driver. It's got a lot of rust in it. I'm going to slowly cut out and put sheet metal panels in. But Farmington's coming up a week from this Sunday, the 21st, I believe it is, May 21st. We're going to try to have this bus ready to drive to Farmington. So hopefully we'll put the engine in Monday. This is Saturday. And then we'll have a week to make sure there's no bugs in it, no pun intended. And today is July the 2nd, and we did drive this to Farmington, and it did great, got great mileage. we still have to deal with that rough idle, which I have not had time to do yet. This engine did not leak a drop of oil. However, to be honest with you, that seems to always hold true for the first 6 months of a rebuilt engine, and then it'll start to seep from here, there, and yonder, as they all do. And so important, it didn't use any oil at all. And you can see where we had a muffler shop make the new heater tubes. They were rusted completely out. Of course, we had to cut a panel from the inside in order to access that, but that's done. And we've put new sheet metal in the bottom of the battery tray and have that fixed. So I think we're going to be in good shape. I needed to look at this transaxle to make sure that it's the later model with the sleeve over the main shaft that guides the throwout bearing. And there's an excellent article in Hot VWs about pressure plates and throwout bearings and what's compatible and what isn't, and I would highly recommend that you read that article on clutch disc and pressure plates. I personally have always preferred Satch pressure plates, not a race plate, just a standard plate. And if you want a heavier pressure plate, I highly recommend the Kennedy 1700 pound. We've used those for years, but that's only if you really have a high output engine. Now you can see in this corner where I've been doing some sheet metal work on the floor, and I've primed it, and we're not going to worry about grinding down the wales because I believe my son is going to put some type of floor covering in here. But there are some other little panels that I've welded in that are going to show, and I'll have to grind down and do a little body work on, like right here. But it's coming along. I just want to add something, and I say this in every VW video that I make. Being 74 years old and being in this business my entire life, starting with motor scooters and go-karts when I was like 9, 10 years old, I have my own way of doing things, and that doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily agree with what I say and what I do, but what I have done and the way I do things has worked well for me all my life. And you know, what works well with you might not work well with me. So I don't mind a difference of opinion. Well, will it run? Is the transmission in good shape? The transaxle? Nothing?
Nothing.
So what happened here, you're probably familiar with if you've had very many Volkswagens. This bus wouldn't start until I tapped on the starter while my son held it over to start. Then it started. Well, I knew right off from experience that I was going to have to use a relay to provide full 12 volts. The problem is that there's so much voltage lost through this old harness to the starter solenoid that it doesn't receive enough current to trip that solenoid. If you wire in a separate little Ford solenoid or a Bosch relay, you can feed 12 volts to that starter solenoid directly and it will fire right up. That is so common. We've had to do several of our Volkswagens that way. Okay, will it run and does it have a good transaction? Well, the transaxle is fine. The shifter, however, is way off, whether it's worn out or just out of adjustment. That's yet to be determined. But all went well. All we had to do now was to line it up. My son had replaced a tie rod and it was a half of an inch out of alignment. But there's a video on how I line up a VW using very simple tools and a handmade apparatus, as you see here, bolted to the disc brake rotor. You can measure between these front and rear to get your toe in. Of course, the toe in on the front should be 1/8. And I made this little bracket, line-up bracket. I made it out of what I had at the shop, a small piece of channel iron, different bolt patterns for different VWs. On most measuring tapes, there's a little hole in the bracket on the end of the tape where you can hook it over a nail, and that's the reason I have this small brad at the end of this piece of channel iron, so you can hook that tape measure over the end of it, and you can do this with just one person.